An armored truck pulled up outside my ex-wife's $900,000 house on a Tuesday morning. Two men in body armor carried her spousal support up the front steps in canvas bags and emptied it onto her marble floor. $2,000 in pennies and nickels. She stood there in her robe screaming at me over the noise of it, and the whole street came out to watch. That was the cheapest thing I did to her all year. My name is Kurt D'Angelo. My wife slept with half the lawyers in her own firm, and when we got to court, the judge handed her my house, my money, and my daughter. 8 months later, I was in a cell in Cook County, and I would not say sorry. By the time I walked out of there, 10 lawyers, 4 paralegals, 6 politicians, and that judge had lost everything they had. I never laid a hand on one of them. The spousal support is set at $2,000 a month. You'll continue paying the mortgage on the marital home. $1,000 for child support, plus health insurance until the child turns 18. And if she goes to college, you'll cover that as well. I sat there and did the arithmetic while he was still talking. $6,500 a month, out of my pocket, into hers. She made $110,000 a year. I said nothing. The money I could live with. I've made money my whole life, and I can make it again. What I could not live with was the custody. My daughter is called Regina. Everybody calls her Gina, except her mother. She had told the court in her own words that she wanted to live with me, 15 years old, and she stood up and said it. The judge gave her to Lily anyway, and never explained why. You should know what kind of man was sitting in that chair. I grew up on the south side of Chicago. I own rental property, 31 doors, all of it bought with cash. I own a few small businesses, and I have what you might politely call a knack for finding the opening in a situation. Some of the ways I used that knack when I was younger, I would not put in writing. I intended to follow the judge's order to the letter, every letter. One of those businesses supplies coin to laundromats and car washes, rolled change in bulk by the pallet. I sat in my truck outside the courthouse, and I looked at that order again, $2,000 a month in spousal support. It did not say by check. It did not say by transfer. It said $2,000. And there's a very old piece of federal law about what counts as dollars in this country. I had 30 days before the first payment, and I used all of them. The child support went into an account in Gina's name. Her mother would never see a cent of it. But my daughter could buy whatever she needed, whenever she needed it, and the order was satisfied. I put Gina on a gold-plated health plan. I put her mother on the cheapest high-deductible policy I could legally call insurance. Every box on that order ticked. On the 30th day, an armored car pulled into her driveway. I paid for 2 guards in full kit because I wanted it to look like exactly what it was. Lily came out onto the step in her robe with a friend behind her, and she watched them unload bag after bag, and I watched her face change from confusion to something else. Up the steps, across the marble, and then, one bag at a time, onto the floor of her entrance hall. $4,000 weighs about a ton in pennies. It does not pour, it avalanches, and it does not stop for a long time. Half the streets stood on their lawns for it. These were her people, the ones she moved us across the city to impress, and they stood on their own grass in their bathrobes and watched 2 guards bury her hallway in copper. She was screaming before the second bag was open. I was parked across the road the whole time. When the truck pulled out, she came down the driveway after it and she saw me, and she started on me instead. I put the window down. I told her I hoped she enjoyed her money and that she should give my regards to whichever one of them she was with that week. Then I waved at her, and I drove home. I want to be honest with you about something. That felt wonderful. The following Tuesday, a man came up to me outside one of my buildings and asked if I was Kurt D'Angelo. I looked at him and said nothing at all. He took my photograph with the summons held up beside my face. They do that now. And when I would not put my hand out for it, he dropped it on the pavement, told me I'd been served, and walked off. I picked it up. Court the following Wednesday. I had a week. I spent most of it with my lawyer and one lunch of it with my daughter, who was furious with her mother and not hiding it well. I told her the truth, because I have never once lied to that girl. I said there is a real chance this judge puts me in jail, and if he does, I need you to hold steady and not make it worse for yourself. She said, then don't apologize to him. 15 years old. Court day. We waited at the table, my lawyer and I, and when Lily arrived with hers, they came past us slowly enough to enjoy it. She said something about how the change had scratched her floors. Her lawyer said something about how he hoped I'd brought my toothbrush. Gina had come, and she started to answer them, and the judge came in at that exact moment and told my daughter to be quiet before he had even sat down. He said he had read the accusations against me, and he was standing by his custody decision. My lawyer said, Your Honor, what accusations? Nothing has ever been filed. And the judge said, I'm talking about a report from a psychiatrist. 4 months earlier, we had sent Gina to talk to someone because the divorce was wrecking her grades. Her mother had gotten hold of those notes, and out of them she had built the only accusation that can never be washed off a father. I have been hit with a bat. I would rather be hit with a bat. I sat there in a public courtroom while a man in a robe implied I had done something to my own child and would not hear one word from my side of the table. My daughter was 8 feet behind me listening to it, and I looked up at that bench and I made him a promise, silently, that I fully intended to keep. He had no idea what he had just done. Her lawyer asked the court to find me in willful violation. He explained about the pennies and the nickels, and the damage, and the hours it took to clean up. My lawyer did not wait for the judge. He said, Section 5103 of Title 31 United States Code. Coins and currency are legal tender for all debts, public charges, taxes, and dues. My client has paid the support, the mortgage, and the insurance in lawful money of the United States. We have receipts for all of it. Then her lawyer said his client had not received $1 of child support. True, said mine. It goes directly to the daughter, for whatever she needs. And you can ask her, she's sitting right there. And the judge, who by now was several steps behind the conversation, looked up at my 15-year-old. And my 15-year-old looked straight back at him and nodded. I watched her lawyer lean over and start whispering fast. They had come in to win, and they were losing. Her lawyer asked if future payments could be made by check, and the judge said that sounded reasonable. My lawyer said, Before Your Honor rules, are the Chicago police part of the legal system of this city? The judge said, Of course they are. Then why, said my lawyer, if my client's car is impounded by that same legal system, will they not take his check, cash or card only? If the police won't accept one, why must he pay support with one? The room went quiet, and that judge, who had a lawyer standing in front of him, holding a federal statute in one hand and the Chicago police impound in the other, could not find a single legal sentence to say. So he said this instead, because this is my courtroom, and I make the rules in here. That is a direct quote. There was a court reporter typing it down, and that is the moment I stopped being careful. I stood up. My lawyer put a hand on my sleeve and I took it off. I said, You're the law in here, are you? You've spent this whole morning trying to please my wife's law firm. Were you one of the ones she was sleeping with too? You could hear the stenographer stop. Somewhere behind me, my daughter said, Dad! And the judge came up out of that chair the color of a brick. Mr. D'Angelo, you are in contempt of this court. 6 months in Cook County Jail unless you apologize to me now and agree to abide by whatever this court orders. Who do you think you are? I said. The king of this joke of a courtroom? I don't believe anybody had spoken to him like that in 20 years on the bench. He said, Take him. And a deputy came around the table for me. On the way out, I looked over at Lily and her lawyer. They had won. 6 months, and the man who signs the checks locked in a county facility, and they had absolutely no idea what they had just bought. I said, Good luck collecting your dirty money now. She had this look on her face like the machine had come out ahead. I have thought about that look many times since. She really had no idea. They took me to holding. You strip. You put your own life in a paper sack. They hand you county clothes and a number, and everything you were an hour ago stops applying. Then they move you across to the jail itself. Jail is a polite word. Cook County is one of the largest single-site detention facilities in this country. And from the inside, it does not feel like a county anything. It feels like a prison, because it is one. Word travels ahead of you in there. 2 officers had me sorted before I was through the second gate. The guy who mouthed off to a judge, the big man from the South Side who thinks he's untouchable. They wanted me to know how the next 6 months were going to feel. I said nothing. I'm 6'4", and I was 255 pounds that year, most of it from doing my own roofing. And I had done juvenile time. I knew the shape of this. My plan for jail was simple, and it was not brave. Keep to myself, eat, sleep, lift, watch the doors, blend into the wall, do the 6 months and go home to my daughter. Every real problem in a place like that comes from being interesting. I had 211 days left and every intention of being the most boring man in the building. That lasted until the first dinner. I took my tray and put my back against the wall to eat, watching the room the way you do. And then over the top of all that noise, somebody said a name I had not been called in 22 years. Tex. My street name, from when I was a kid, from a life I had bricked over. And walking across that hall towards me was Randall Turner, who everybody has always called Ringer, grinning like it was a school reunion. Every head in the room turned. I put the tray down and we shook, right hands clasped, my other arm around his shoulder, and half that hall recalculated me in about 4 seconds. "What in God's name are you doing in here?" he said. I said I told a judge what I thought of him. He laughed so hard a guard looked over. "Yeah," he said, "that'll do it." "How long?" 6 months, I said, "unless I apologize." So, 6 months. We ate and we talked, and I got looked at from every table in that room. He asked me what my plan was, for my ex-wife and her partners and the judge. He asked it like a man who already knew the answer, because he had known me at 15. They called me Tex when I was young, and it had nothing to do with Texas except the saying, "Don't mess with Texas." Whoever did, paid, and the payment was always public enough that the next one thought twice. "So what's the move?" he said. I told him some of it, that I had known this was coming for weeks, and had started arranging things while I was still a free man. That there were people on the outside holding pieces of it already. He said, "You need help, you say the word." I said, "Maybe, not yet." He said, "I'll introduce you to some of my guys either way, and here, what matters is how many people have a reason to stand near you." That night I lay in a bunk 11 miles from a house I own outright, and I asked myself how a man ends up here. Not the courtroom, the whole road. Because I did not start out the kind of man who orders an armored truck to make a point. Somebody built that man, and I know exactly who, and it was not the woman I married. To tell you the rest of this properly, I have to go a long way back. My father was a drunk with a temper, and my mother was a woman who had learned to be somewhere else in the room. I had a younger brother, Ken, 3 years behind me, built like a kite and twice as clever. What I mostly remember about being 10 is standing in a doorway making myself the loudest thing in the house, so that whatever was coming came at me and not at him. That is the whole architecture of me, right there. So I lived outside. I found 4 or 5 others with the same kind of front door, and we ran together. Not a gang, whatever the police report said, just a set of kids with nowhere better. Mostly it was stupid. Some of it was theft. 2 of it was cars, and the second car was how, at 17, I ended up standing in front of a judge for the first time in my life. Juvenile detention was the best thing that ever happened to me, and I'd say that to anyone. It was 11 months of somebody else deciding when I ate. I came out of there having made myself exactly one promise. Nobody is ever again going to be in a position to tell me what I'm doing tomorrow. Not a boss, not a bank, and I thought, not a court. 2 out of 3 in the end. At 20, I bought a house at a tax foreclosure auction for $11,000. Roof gone, copper gone, a tree growing through the back porch. I lived in one room of it for 14 months and rebuilt the rest with my own hands. And then I rented it out, and then I did it again. Cash for the first, rent from the first towards the second. I have never in my life signed for a loan. Remember that. It matters later. I met Lily at 22, in a club whose name I genuinely cannot remember. She was from Seymour, Indiana, a small town whose one claim is a singer, and she'd tell you about him inside 10 minutes. She had come to Chicago the way people from Seymour come to Chicago. I had come up out of the South Side. On paper, we had nothing in common, and in that room, it did not matter at all. Married inside a year. Gina a year after that. I'd bought a place in Oak Forest to flip, and she walked into it and fell in love with the staircase. So we kept it and made it ours. We spent 10 years on that house. New kitchen one winter, the porch another, the two of us, and a radio and a baby asleep upstairs. Barbecues in the yard where you could not see the end of the table for people. If you had asked me then, I would have told you I had everything a man needs, and I would have been right. Then Gina started school, and Lily went back to work, and inside 4 years, she had gone from the reception desk to paralegal to the personal assistant of a rising partner who took a very direct interest in her career. And she changed. Not slowly. The clothes changed, then the restaurants, then the friends, and then the way she talked about money, which had never been a thing we discussed, because we had it, and now it was the only subject in the house. And she started talking about Southsiders, where I'm from, and where our neighbors were from, and what those people are like. A girl from a town of 18,000 people in southern Indiana, explaining to me across my own kitchen island what the wrong sort of Chicagoan is. We argued about it more than we ever argued about money. I should have understood then that she was not describing our neighbors. She was describing me. 3 years ago, she got her way and we bought in Wilmette. $900,000, North Shore, the good schools, and it was the good schools that she used on me because, what am I going to say to that? She decorated it to the last cushion. I never once sat down in that house and felt like a man in his own home. And my daughter, who had been happy, came home from that school in week 3 and asked when we were going back. It ended on a Friday. She said she was going dancing with the girls from the office. We had the same phones on the same family plan, and I had never once looked. But that night, at about 7:30, I sat in my truck outside a job site and I looked. And then I drove into the city, and I paid a cover charge to stand at the back of a club and watch my wife of 16 years on a dance floor. I want to be clear that I did not see anything I could not have talked myself out of. Not yet. Close dancing, hands, a lot of laughing. I was still building the argument in my head that I was being ridiculous. Then I went to use the men's room, and while I was standing in a stall, 2 men came in, and one of them started talking about my wife by name, and I stood absolutely still. The first one said, "You and Lily were about ready to go at it right there on the floor." The other one said, "Yeah, she's wild, and she can talk too." First one said, "She's coming home with me tonight." Finally, something more than a quickie in the office or the back of my car. And the other one said, "Maybe next weekend it's my turn." Then they washed their hands and left, and I stood in that stall with the tile against my forehead. So it was not a man, it was a Rhoda. I came out and found her on the floor in the arms of one of them, and at 9:30 my phone went. She'd had too much to drink, she said, and she didn't feel safe on the train that late, so she'd stay at Paula's from the office. I typed back, "That's okay." She sent me a heart. I watched her pick up her purse and leave that club on the arm of the man from the men's room. I followed them. Not close. They were not looking for anybody. They were not looking at anything except each other. And they got into a black Lexus outside and sat there in the light of the parking structure for a while. Then he drove, and I drove, 3 cars back, all the way to a building in the West Loop, and I watched the gate of the garage come down behind them. And then something in me went very quiet and very organized. I drove to Wilmette. It was gone 11. I woke my daughter up and I said, "Pack whatever you actually want. We're leaving and we're not coming back." She was out of that bed before I finished the sentence. She asked about her mother. I said, "Your mother has other people to look after her now." 15 years old, and she looked at me for about 2 seconds and then went to get her boxes. She understood the whole thing from one sentence. It took us 3 hours, 2 trips in the truck, her room, my clothes, my tools, the good pans and the photographs off the walls. I took every photograph in that house, which I still think was the meanest thing I did that whole night. Oak Forest was sitting empty because I had never been able to make myself sell it. At 4 in the morning, my daughter fell asleep in her own old bedroom, and I sat on the porch until it got light. She called at 11 the next morning. "Kurt, what's happening? Where are you?" "Home," I said, and you could hear her work it out in real time. She said, "Why?" I said, "Because I know you now, and I don't want to." She asked where Gina was. "With me," I said. "She doesn't want to live with you anymore." And then she tried the only thing she had left, which was that this was about money. She said, "Just because you don't like living well doesn't mean you get to walk out and take our daughter." I said, "No, Lily. But having a wife who's been passed around her own office is a fine reason to leave. Expect the papers next week." She went silent for a second. And then she said, "You low-life Southsider, you have no idea what you've started. My firm will bury you." I said, "Maybe, but I'll be standing at the end of it." She did not try to fix it. Not once, not in 6 months. What she did was work on our daughter. Gina told me all of it eventually. The nights her mother didn't come in until after midnight, the things she said about me, and the advice, which was that Gina should find herself a wealthy man and never do a day's work in her life. My 15-year-old told her mother she'd rather be poor in Oak Forest. That is the child that woman was raising. And that is how a man ends up in a county bunk, doing arithmetic at 2 in the morning. She thought she had won that day in court. What she had actually done was take a $900,000 jumbo mortgage, a $900 a month insurance bill, and a lifestyle built on my income, and lock the income in a building in the middle of Chicago. I did the sums twice and went to sleep. And then it was Thursday. 2 officers came for me on the Thursday and said I had a video conference. My lawyer had not called and no lawyer was scheduled. And I said so, and they said, "Sit down." It was a bare room with a table, 1 chair, a camera bracket on the wall with no camera in it. They put me in the chair. Then they went back out and shut the door, and I heard the lock, and I understood exactly what was about to happen. The door opened and 6 men came in. Not one of them said a word to me, which is how you know it was ordered rather than personal. I got my back into the corner and I did what I could, and there's nothing in it worth telling you. 2 guards stood outside a locked room in a county facility and let it run. And then they walked me down to the infirmary between them, so it would look like they'd found me. I came round in the infirmary the next morning with a rib situation, a face I would not have recognized, and both wrists strapped to the frame of the bed. Sunlight on the wall, so I'd been out the whole night. And I lay there and I thought, they took my daughter. They made me pay for my wife's boyfriends. They put me in here, and now they've done this. And every single part of it was carried out by somebody in a uniform. I was so full of hate, I could not see straight. There was a nurse standing over me, and I was glaring at her like she'd done it herself. She said quite evenly, "I'm here to help you, not to hurt you. You're badly injured. I can make that better, or you can lie there and hurt. Take your time." I got something like a smile onto my face, and I apologized. Her name was Beth, and she had clearly had that conversation 400 times. She came back with breakfast and undid one of my hands. While I ate, I asked her for a favor. I wanted to see Randall Turner. She said she would see what she could do, and the next day she did it. Ringer came through that door, saw what was in the bed, and said, "Oh, crap." He knew me. He knew precisely what was going to happen next, and it was written on his face before I had said a word. I said, "Sit down, I need something." I described the 6 who came into that room and the 2 who stood outside it. I said, "I need the full names of all 8, not the nicknames, the names that appear on paperwork." He said, "Oh, crap," again. He says it the way other men breathe. And then he said, "What's the plan?" "An eye for an eye," I said, but with a twist. He got me the list in 2 days. He asked again what I was doing with it. I said, "The less you know, the better." Ken came on the Tuesday. My brother has been in and around computers since he was 11 years old, first for games and then for the other thing. And he is the only person alive who can make me feel slow. He looked at my face and said, "You're an improvement on Friday." Then he switched into the language we invented as children, the one we built so we could talk about our parents at the dinner table. 40 years old and we still use it. "Gina gave you the list," he said. "I've made a start. What is it you actually want?" I said, "I want to know what every one of those 8 men is keeping from his wife or his girlfriend." Not gossip, documents, bank, phone, hotel, whatever's there. He looked at me for a while. Then he said in English, "Oh, crap." I said, "That's all you have to do. Get it to Gummy and send Gummy to me without the paperwork." Because here's the twist, and I have never once regretted the shape of it. Those 8 men put me in a room and took something off me that I could not get back. I was not going to touch a hair on anybody they loved. I was going to hand the women in their lives the truth about them, in an envelope, with dates and amounts, and then stand back. Every one of those 8 men had built his life on his wife not knowing something. Gummy came on the Friday. He has been part of my life since we were 9, and he still lives in my parents' old house in Lansing. He said, "Ken, pass me the package. What's the plan?" I said, "Did you hear what happened to me?" He said, "Yes." I said, "It goes out the same day at the same hour to all 8. No return address. Nothing that comes back to me. And every one of them is to be told exactly why. And put a line in each one," I said. "Just the 4 words. Don't mess with Texas." He nodded and he left, and that was the entire extent of my involvement. One conversation, in a room with a camera in it, in which a man visiting an inmate was told to post some letters. I want you to notice that I never asked for anybody to be hurt. I did not need anybody to be hurt. I had something much slower than that. I should say how that list traveled, because it went out of that building inside my daughter's shirt. She came on the Sunday, saw me bandaged, and cried before she was in the chair. I told her it looked worse than it was, which was a lie. Then I gave her a folded piece of paper and asked her to get it to Uncle Ken. She had it inside her bra before I had finished the sentence, and she asked me nothing, not one question. Lily had driven her, and she went first. She sat down, looked at the state of me, and said, "I see you're getting along with your own kind." Then, "Are you ready to be reasonable and apologize yet?" Then when I told her what she could do with that, she said the other thing. She said, "How do I know you never touched Regina? She's unusually attached to you." In a room with a guard in it, about her own daughter. I said, "Why don't you go back to your lawyers and let them use you up? Maybe then you'll see what you are." And she leaned in and she said, "Just so you know, I've offered myself to all of them, and they loved it." Then she smiled at me, because she thought she had finally reached something. She had. She had also, in about 90 seconds, taken every doubt I still had about what I was doing and burned it. "Send Gina in," I said. "We're finished." 3 weeks later, the letters landed. I knew because a Tuesday came where 2 of the officers were not on shift, and one of the 6 was sitting in the day room with a face like a funeral. Then one of them came at me across the room, and 8 of Ringer's people stood up out of their seats, and he stopped 4 feet away and told me his girl had left him. I said, "I did warn you, don't mess with Texas." 2 days after that, the 2 officers found me by the stairs. One of them told me they were going to make the rest of my sentence a nightmare. I said their wives had my sympathies already, and the bigger one put me against the wall and started in on me. And I did not lift a hand. Not one hand, for what felt like a very long time, in front of 40 inmates and 2 ceiling cameras. Then his partner pulled him off me. Back to the infirmary and back to Beth, who looked at me and said, "So, we've got a troublemaker." I said I hadn't thrown a punch, and she said she knew, and that this time there were too many witnesses and he would lose his job over it. She said, "Those officers are there to keep you safe, whether you like it or not." I said, "That one stood outside a locked room and listened." She didn't have an answer for that. She kept me overnight. Meanwhile, in Wilmette, the arithmetic was doing its work. No spousal support because I had no income while I was inside. No mortgage payment for the same reason. Her salary against a jumbo loan, North Shore taxes, and a lifestyle designed to be photographed. The bank sends 3 letters, and then it stops sending letters. I sat in a cell and watched the calendar and thought about which room those letters would be piling up in. A few weeks in, they told me the judge wanted to see me in the video room. I asked whether my lawyer would be present. They said the judge was waiting. I said, "Then the judge can reschedule. My calendar is extremely open." That cost me 3 days and bought me a properly warned lawyer, who came in half an hour early and told me he had received no filing. No agenda and no explanation, which he said out loud was strange. The judge came up on the screen annoyed about the delay. My lawyer asked what the purpose of the meeting was. He said, "You didn't need to bring your lawyer. I only wanted to know whether he's ready to apologize." I whispered to my lawyer, and my lawyer said, "My client declines to apologize and requests an apology from the court. He further requests primary custody of his daughter." The judge's face did something I enjoyed very much. He said he stood by his decision and owed nobody an apology. My lawyer thanked him and started to close the meeting, and then the judge said, "One more thing." And there it was. "Your client isn't meeting the terms. When does he intend to resume the spousal support and the mortgage?" A sitting judge, on a video link, with no filing before him and no motion of any kind, chasing a woman's mortgage payment. My lawyer wrote one word on his pad and underlined it. I said it myself to the screen. "I don't intend to pay anything while I'm in here. No work, no income." He said the house is going into foreclosure. I said that is my wife's mansion, not my home, and I never wanted it. He said you'll destroy your credit and lose your equity. I said I have never borrowed $1 in my life except for that house, and I will take the hit gladly to see her where she belongs. And then, because I could not help myself, I said, "Perhaps one of her lovers can cover it. There's a dozen of them. Surely between them." He came off that bench at me. "Who do you think you're talking to, you Southside nothing?" And I said, "I'm talking to a man who's been involved with my wife. If I'm wrong, I apologize. But I can't work out why somebody with no stake in this cares so much about her mortgage." Then I stood up and walked to the door. Behind me, I heard him say, "Your client just earned himself another 2 months. And if he keeps disrespecting this court, I'll make his life a living hell." I did not turn around. I was grinning at a cinder block wall in a county jail, because I had walked in there with a lawyer he told me not to bring, and that lawyer had sat through the entire thing with a phone face down on the table and the record running. So it was 8 months instead of 6, and I did not mind. The mortgage was in her name too. Every extra week I sat in that building was another week of letters arriving in Wilmette. And she had, without meaning to, told her lawyer friends about the mortgage, and one of them had gone and spoken to a judge about it, and that judge had put himself on a recording. There were 4 of us in that conversation, and only one of us was in a cell. The following Sunday she came because she could not bear not to. Gina heard she was coming and insisted on coming with her. Lily sat down and said, "So, you've managed to anger the judge again and earn yourself 2 more months. When are you going to learn you can't beat the system?" I said, "Lily, stop talking to me. Just make sure Gina gets here on Sundays." And she practically shouted it, "It's Regina," every single time. Then Gina came in and she was lit up. I asked why. She said, "Because I get to see my dad." I said, "That's not the only reason." She said, "I do have a surprise, but I can't tell you yet." Then she took out a piece of paper, folded so that only a signature line showed, and said, "Do you trust me?" "With my life," I said. "Then sign it without reading it." And I looked at that girl for a moment, and I signed it. She asked if it was true about the 2 extra months. I said it was, and that I was sorry. She said, "Whatever you did, he probably deserved it." Then she said the thing that took the wind out of me. "My birthday's next month. I'd love you to be out for it, but I wouldn't want you to give up your principles for a party. We can do it properly when you're home." 16 years old, giving her father permission to miss her birthday. I sat there thinking, maybe I was being a stubborn fool and it was costing my child. And then she said, "If a person doesn't have principles, he has nothing. Important principles may and must be inflexible." I said, "Where did you get that?" She said, "From Lincoln, and from my counselor at school, Dr. Hodges." My grades slipped and the teachers put me with her. She's the reason I can still be in the same room as Mom. Remember that name, Dr. Hodges. Then I told her about her present because I had one and it was already done. Greg, who runs my businesses when I can't, had been to see my lawyer that week. The Oak Forest house, the one with the staircase, the one we spent 10 years on, is going into a trust in her name. Not mine anymore, hers. held for her until she's an adult. She said, "Can I live there?" "Of course," I said. "I'll pay you rent." Now, the part I had started arranging before I ever went inside. When I knew that court date was coming, Greg hired a cleaning contractor, a real one with a real contract, paid substantially above the going rate, and the crew that serviced the offices of my wife's law firm at night were paid the difference in cash, personally, by a man they never saw twice. And over 5 weeks, in those offices, some very small cameras were installed. Gummy came in and told me it was all in hand, and what came off those cameras was not what people assume when I tell this story. There was some of that, and I did not need it. What was on those cameras was money, envelopes, 2 paralegals and a partner discussing a file that was about to stop existing. 3 men who hold elected office in this state, in a room they thought was empty, arranging things they are not permitted to arrange. My brother took it from there, and my brother is careful. It went up anonymously, in pieces, over days, in the way that things go up when somebody understands how they are traced. No demands, no blackmail. I want that on the record, because blackmail is a crime and I was already in jail. Just the footage with dates and file names sent to the sort of people who cannot afford to sit on it. And on every single one of them, 4 words: "Don't mess with Texas." I was in my bunk when it broke. You can hear news move through a jail. It comes down the tier like weather. Within an hour, men I had never spoken to were saying those 4 words at me down the walkway. Every outlet in Chicago had it by the evening. The tabloids had it by the morning. And somewhere in the loop, 10 lawyers and 6 politicians woke up to the fact that a room they had been careless in was not empty. The biggest of the 6 came to my cell that week. He stood in the doorway and he apologized, properly, without excuses, which is more than I have had from men in better suits. I said, "I warned you not to touch me, and now some others are finding out what that costs." I match kindness with kindness and violence with violence. He asked if we were square. I said we were, and I told him that size is not the same thing as safety. He nodded and went away. 3 days later, I was called to the video room with my lawyer, who sat down and said, "Any idea what this is about?" I said, "Time will tell." The judge appeared, and he was not a judge on that screen. He was a frightened man in a robe. He said, "You did this." I said, "I'm sorry, what?" He said, "You're Tex, aren't you?" I said, "I've been called that." He said, "You'll pay for this." I said, "Your Honor, I've been locked in this building for 4 months. He said, "You have friends." I said, "We all have friends." He told me to call off my dogs. I said, "Now you're calling my friends dogs. They may not care for that. Corner a dog and sometimes you get bitten." He said, "Are you threatening me?" I said, "No, I'm quoting my grandmother." And then he lost the last of it entirely. He said, "I will make your life hell. Watch your back when you get out. You'll answer to people who don't care what happens to you, and I'll be pleased with whatever they do." Then he cut the link. I turned to my lawyer and said, "Did you get that?" He showed me his phone. In the state of Illinois, intimidation is a Class 3 felony, and the Judicial Inquiry Board is extremely interested in judges who commit them on the record. A few days later, Lily came. She sat down and said, "You bastard!" I asked what was wrong. She said, "I've been fired. My face is in every paper in this city. How could you do this to me?" I said, "I didn't do it. You did." She said, "Do you hate me that much?" I said, "Yes, you and every lawyer in that building who thinks the rest of us are furniture. You used to be a nice girl from a small town." She said, "What am I supposed to do? No job. Nobody in this city will hire me." I said, "Go home to Seymour." She said, "I can't. The local paper is calling me the center of a Chicago scandal, and my parents are retiring early and moving to Florida to get away from the talk." I said, "Florida might suit you." She said, "They don't want me either. They barely speak to me." And I looked at her and thought, your parents, your husband, and your daughter, all 3. I told her that if her own child didn't want to be near her, she might consider that the common factor was standing in front of me. She put her head on that table and cried, and I did not feel one thing about it. The next day, the news carried a fire on the top floor of a downtown office building. Gutted, sprinklers saved the floors below. The day after that, Ken mentioned the same firm's off-site backup server had failed. Twice. I have no knowledge of either event. 2 weeks later, Gina came in glowing. She said, "I finished your surprise." I said, "Does it involve the Oak Forest house? Did you and your mother move back?" "Close," she said. "Mom's being evicted from the Wilmette house, and I'm moving to Oak Forest." I said, "That's not possible. The court gave your mother custody until you're 18. And she said, "That's the surprise. I got emancipated. With the house in trust for me, it was easy. I needed somewhere safe to live." That was the paper. The folded one, with only the line showing that her father signed without reading in a county visitation room. A 16-year-old had gone to a court in the state, the same court system that had ignored her when she asked to live with me, and had herself declared a legal adult, and got it. She had a house in her name, savings of her own, school records, and an adult professional prepared to stand up and say she was capable. And they granted it. She said her counselor had driven her, and would I like to meet her? I said yes, and I meant something else by it. I have a daughter, and a man's interest in her is a thing I check. She said, "I'll get her." And when the door opened, it was a woman I had last seen when we were both 17 years old. Alexandria Frederico. Everybody on our street called her Freddie. Dr. Hodges was Freddie from 4 doors down. "Freddie," I said. "Haven't heard that in 20 years, she said. Gina was looking between us like we'd done a card trick. 9 months earlier, a girl in her office had a surname that isn't common, and a father called Kurt, and Freddie had thought, "I know exactly one Kurt D'Angelo." She said, "You were a menace back then." I said, "Some things don't change." She said, "Should I call you Tex?" And my daughter said, "Why Tex?" And 2 adults changed the subject at the same time. She said, "I hope you don't mind me spending time with Regina." And my daughter said, "It's Gina." Freddie said, "Sorry, my mistake." And she said it the way you say it when you'll remember. She had helped Gina through the emancipation, helped her pick furniture for a house she was moving into alone at 16, and taken nothing for any of it. I said, "Thank you." She said, "She's like family, Tex. I've got attached. Come out and I'll buy you dinner." The day came. 8 months. They brought me to court for release, and it was a different judge on that bench. I never found out for certain what happened to the first one, and I have never needed to. Gina was there, Freddie was there, Lily was there at the back. The new judge read the file and said, "Mr. D'Angelo, what do you have to say for yourself?" I said, "I served the 6 months and the extra 2. He said, "You could have apologized on any day of those 8 months and walked out." I said, "I didn't believe the other judge had earned an apology, so I served his sentence instead." He said, "You're a stubborn man." I said, "I prefer strong-willed. It's been good to me in business, and it's been good to me in life." He almost smiled. Then he said, "The settlement stands, and you owe restitution." The judge said, 8 months of spousal support alone is $16,000. Never mind the mortgage. And my lawyer said, "Your Honor, the order reads until the minor child becomes a legal adult. That child has been emancipated for 3 months as documented. And the house was foreclosed 3 months ago, so there is no loan to pay. By our calculation, my client owes $1,782. He'll pay $20,000 today and consider all ties severed." Lily was on her feet before he finished. "$20,000? You owe me far more than that. You keep paying until Regina is 18. And the new judge turned and said, "Madam, I will handle every matter in this courtroom. Sit down." Then he read the documents himself, twice, and could not find one thing in them to argue with. He said, "If these figures hold, I'll accept it." And then he told the 2 of us to be civil for the sake of our daughter, and asked for my word. He got it. "Mr. D'Angelo, you're free to go." Gina hit me somewhere around the ribs before I was through the gate and did not let go for a while. Freddie stood a few feet back smiling at the floor, and Lily came over and said, "$20,000, that's it, that's not fair." And I said, "Lily, you chose them over us. Let them keep you." She said, "I have nothing." And she meant it, and it was true. So here's the part people don't expect. I told her I own a rental on the south side. It's empty, and she can have it rent-free for 6 months while she finds work. She said, "Move back to the south side?" I said, "It's free, Lily. There's no arguing with free." She made a noise that I have heard for 20 years and she took the address. I did not do that to be a better man than her. I did it because Gina was standing right there. I asked the two of them if they were ready to go, and they were. "I owe you a dinner," I said to Freddie. "I think you do," she said. "RPM Italian, 7:30. I booked it the day my release was confirmed. I need the taste of that place out of my mouth." Out of the corner of my eye, I watched Lily hear that. RPM was where we went for anniversaries. Then I said, "Before dinner, can we just drive? I'd like to feel it." And in the car, I did a stupid thing kindly meant. I said, "Freddie, I booked for 4. See if your husband can join us." And the car went silent. Then my daughter said, "Dad, she doesn't have a husband anymore. I never told you." I was lost, because that woman wore her rings every single time I had seen her. And Freddie said, "It's all right, he didn't know." She said, "My husband was killed on the Eisenhower about 5 years ago. A semi came across and put him into the divider. They told me it was instant. I said I was more sorry than I could say and that I had assumed because of the rings." She said, "I know. I can't take them off yet. It feels like agreeing to it." And then she said, "A psychologist who can't manage her own grief. I've heard that one before." I said, "Not from me." Dinner was the best 2 hours of that entire year. Real clothes. A table nobody was watching. I had spent 8 months keeping my back to a wall, and it took me until the second course to stop looking at the door. And somewhere in there, I realized I'd been so far inside my own revenge for 8 months that I'd never once asked that woman a single question about her own life. So I asked, and I listened, which I am not always good at. At the end of the meal, I said, "Alexandria, when you're ready, and only then, will you let me take you out properly? I'll wait as long as that takes. Can we stay in touch until then?" And my daughter said, "Dad, she's not getting rid of me anyway." Freddie said, "I wouldn't want her to." Then she said, "Mike and I never had children. The studies, his business, the timing was never right. Having Gina has been the best year I've had since he died." We drove to Oak Forest. The shutters had been painted. The bushes were cut back. Somebody had put a light in the window. Inside, that house looked more like a home than it had in 10 years of me working on it, and I could see a woman's hand in every room of it. And I stood in my own front hall, a man who had been in Cook County that morning, and my eyes went in front of both of them. Freddie said, "Kurt." I wiped my face and said, "I feel like I'm home." And she said, "Kurt." I turned around, and she was standing in my hallway, taking her rings off, one and then the other, and putting them in her pocket, and smiling at me while she did it. I've been told I'm a hard man. I did not have one hard thing left in me by then. I put my arms around her. Here's the final count, and I have never once pretended I'm proud of all of it. 10 lawyers, 4 paralegals, 6 elected officials, and 1 judge. All of them lost their careers, and most of them lost their marriages, over what came out of a divorce they thought was too small to be careful about. I was in a cell for every day of it. Whether you want to call that stubborn or strong-willed, I'll answer to either. Lily married a wealthy lawyer. She has the big house in Winnetka, and the status she wanted so badly that she traded a family for it. And she got there in the end, so perhaps that is a happy ending. Her husband is a serial womanizer who keeps her for the look of the thing. I don't say that with any pleasure. I say it because she had all of this once, in a house in Oak Forest, and she could not see it. And Gina got a mother. She also got a brother and a sister, 18 years behind her, twins, which nobody warned us about. We named them Frederick and Alexis, after the woman who was there for my daughter every week that I could not be. I have 31 doors, a family in the house with the staircase, and no loan against my name. My ex-wife has status. I hope she's content with it. I know that I am.